Based on everything I know and research so far, I do not think Roswell had anything to do with extraterrestrials. They would rather have told us that it was men from another world than admit publicly that we had gone up into space. 90% of genuine UFO sightings, in my opinion, are human technology that the public just isn't aware of. That leaves 10%. His consciousness tapped into the launch point of these multiple planes of reality or whatever. He was shown in advance a big chunk of the rest of his life. I look at that as a big overarching mystery is what I'm really digging into. And these books are just stops along the way.
Welcome to Beyond Top Secret, brought to you by the UAP Reporting Center. I'm your host, Joe Biscotto. And before we begin, I just want to ask you to hit the like button, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and get seen by more people. And that's why we're all in this, is to get people on the board up for disclosure. So we have a good show for you guys tonight. We are going to be joined by Walter Bosley. Now, Walter is a former investigator in the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, spent years researching the hidden history of advanced aerospace and kind of the deeper story behind it. He's an author of multiple books. I'll have links in the comments in the show, so go and check those out. He's an author of the Empire of the Wheel series, which is a really great series of books. And actually, Walter is going to be speaking at upcoming UAP event of the year, Contact in the Desert, which is going to be held in Palm Springs, California, May 28th to June 1st. If you're interested in this topic whatsoever, Contact in the Desert is the place to be. Walter is going to be one of the featured speakers there, and highly recommend stopping by his lecture and hearing what he's got to say. Walter, welcome to Beyond Top Secret. How you doing tonight?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me. This should be interesting.
Yeah, I hope so. I've seen some other podcasts that you've been on, and I find, you very interesting in this topic. As kind of what you're focused on is a little different than what everybody hears every day from 100 other people. So I thought you'd be a really interesting guest to have on. And for our viewers who may not be familiar with your work, we can kind of get them introduced to it as well. So, Walter, where'd you grow up at? Like, what's your life? What was your life? Tell us about your life.
Well, I was born in San Diego, and about a little over a month after I was born, not quite 2 months, my parents packed up and moved back to West Virginia, where my dad's from. And I spent the first few years of my life right there in Mothman country in Mineral Wells, West Virginia, where Woody Dernberger, the legendary contactee who introduced us to the mysterious Indrid Cold, was experiencing all this stuff while I was back there as an infant and a small toddler. And then we returned to California. And I've spent much of my life, we did return to West Virginia once briefly, but always coming back to California. And I spent much of my life here in the San Bernardino Valley, other than when I was, in the Air Force and working for Uncle Sam at various jobs. That had me up in the Bay Area, had me in the Baltimore, Washington area, and then in Manhattan. And then when I went into the Air Force, I spent a few years at Wright-Patterson at one assignment. And Air Force sent me on a deployment to Saudi Arabia. I'd always liked what little travel I'd done, but boy, it gave me the bug. And so I went into counterterrorism for a number of years and traveled much of the world. Not always the garden spots, but I love travel, so I find something good about every place. Iraq during the war was about the only place I'd been, and I've been to Afghanistan multiple times. But Iraq was the only place during the war, of course, that I was glad when it was time to go, and I'm not in a hurry to get back. But, I have traveled down to South America. I'm into ancient cities and lost civilizations, that kind of thing. So, I've been to some of those places, and there's a lot more travel I want to do. I started a publishing company in 2002, primarily for classic adventure fiction. And then I ended up writing more nonfiction than I have fiction, because I wrote this little book about Disneyland, the hermetic and alchemical and mystical engineering of Disneyland, and the weird things that can go on there. And following up on that led to another mystery, which led to yet another. And the next thing I knew, I've got, I think, almost 20 nonfiction books, mostly on ancient history, alternative history, that kind of thing. There's the Empire of the Will trilogy, of course, which really drew me because it combined ley lines, or telluric current more accurately, and what appears to be occult serial murder and other really spooky goings on. And I will say, I've written the book about mystical Disneyland. I've written the 3 Empire of the Will books that connected actual espionage with occult serial murder, ley lines, and the airship mystery, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and all sorts of weird stuff. And then I did these books on explorers like Juan Cabrillo, Sir Richard Francis Burton, who I think were looking for something other than what their story tells us. These diverse books. I've written a book about my dad's weird experience underground in Arizona with UFOs and things like that. And I'm mentioning all this because, as diverse as my nonfiction might appear to be, they're all connected. There's 2 threads in particular that connect all my nonfiction. And I found this to be one big fat mystery. What's that?
Like that for a nonfiction book, because a lot of fiction authors like build the universe and everything connects, but so it's really pretty interesting that a nonfiction series is doing that. It's a subject that we're also interested in.
Oh, tell me about it. The 2 threads, after the Empire of the Wheel books, because that was really dark material, I wanted to take a break. So I jumped over to this, what I thought were like archaeological, historical mysteries. And I'll be darned if the 2 threads connecting the Disneyland book with the Empire of the Wheel books on occult murder and stuff, they appeared in my other books. And even when, I'll write a book having to do with UFOs and strange theory, and there were those 2 threads again. They just keep popping up. I'm convinced that if I were to write a book about, well, baseball's mystical to begin with, a book about basketball or football, these 2 threads would pop up. So I look at that as a big overarching mystery, is what I'm really digging into. And these books are just stops along the way.
It kind of sounds like a lot of fun, actually, as well.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, especially about Disney. I had never heard that before, so I'm definitely going to check that out.
Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom is the title of that one. And that's probably the book that most people have heard of and are familiar with.
And that makes sense, because you say Disney to anybody, there's cross appeal to everybody. Loves Disney, and everybody loves a little hint of spooky. If you can combine those 2 things, it's kind of a home run.
Yeah, I think so. I want to throw in there, because we're talking about the books, and I know people are just reflexively going to Amazon. I do not market my books on Amazon. I'm a small press publisher, independent author. Amazon's not always good for guys in my position. So my books are print on demand at my page at lulu.com, LULU.com. If you're interested in my books already, go there. And we'll say that again at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will absolutely have a link for that in the video. So take a look for that at the bottom. Now, Walter, so this is something I found really interesting about your work. And I think it's also pretty unique. When people think about UFO history, they always start with Roswell in 1947. But
Yeah.
your research kind of goes against that a little bit. How much earlier than that do you think this whole thing started?
Well, there's, stories of what we call classic UFOs that people only think of, in the post-World War II era, um, reported in ancient times. This is certainly not, originated with me. Um, this is something that's been going on. These things have been seen for thousands and thousands of years. Now, I lean toward the what's called the Vedic hypothesis, in that we hear about Atlantis, this lost, technically advanced civilization. If you dig deep into it, you don't have to go too deep. You learn that they were in a war with a rival civilization. Well, who was the rival civilization? I think some call it the Rama Empire. Some call it Lemuria. I think Lemuria was more of a subcategory of a greater global and Vedic civilization. What do I mean by that? People think, oh, India, right? But even the scholars in India of this lost Vedic civilization will tell you it wasn't just an ancient India. They say India is a descendant civilization culture of this lost civilization. So this mysterious Vedic civilization was global, and this is where the story of Vimanas come from, the flying machines and this lost technology. So my particular contribution started with kind of reverse engineering, pulling threads between the Bell and the mysterious, use that word a lot, Sonora Aero Club, if you've ever heard of that, Charles Delschow. That's the group of German immigrants in California that were toying around with what we call anti-gravity 10 years before our Civil War in the 1850s. And when you look closely at that, for all the world, it really looks like this Mercury vortex engine idea that powered the Vimanas, according to many sources. So it really does have its roots in a lost technology that was revived primarily by secret societies and other, folks who kind of kept that stuff close to the vest. But it reaches back thousands and thousands of years, I think.
So you spent your career in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. You spent time in the FBI, and a long term in government. So based on that, how did that experience kind of translate over to fringe topics?
Well, having been, I was what they call I was a counterintelligence specialist for the FBI. At one time, I was what they call literally an investigative specialist, and that was, I served on an undercover physical surveillance team that our targets were known and suspected KGB and GRU agents working in the United States. Specifically, I was up in San Francisco doing that. And I mentioned the KGB. That tells you how long ago I started. I started in the last years of the Cold War. And then I went into the Air Force Officer Training School in 93. And I was what's called a direct acquisition. When I went into the Air Force, I already knew that I was going into be an OSI agent. Usually when you go to officer training school, you get your choices, but they tell you where you're going. But I was one of like a handful of people who knew where they were going. And I went right into agent training. And I spent all of my active duty time as an OSI agent in counterespionage operations for most of it. That's double agent operations. And had one deployment in there, like I mentioned before. And then after that, I went to work for another organization in counterterrorism. Did that for 6 years, saw, again, as I mentioned before, much of the world. And when you're in that work, when you're in intelligence work and collections and operations, and especially when you're a federal agent, during my time with the Air Force, I was a badge-carrying federal agent, okay? And conducting felony level investigations and operations and things. And what all that does, what I did in my career is it makes you a better investigator. Okay. It makes you a more critical thinker. It makes you pay attention to the critical detail that you need. It keeps you grounded, because, hey, if I'm not seeing evidence for something, if the in the counterintelligence world, okay, what you call probable cause in the cops and robbers world, we call reason to believe. And this is a list of indicators that suggests, depending on how many indicators there are at once, that you might have a spy, something like that. And it's the same thing as your probable cause. So when you get into the alternative fringe stuff, there's got to be probable cause. There's got to be reasons to believe, to suspect. And what my experience did, because I've always, from the time I was a kid, FBI and Air Force and the other guys, they did their background. They knew what kind of guy I was, what kind of kid I was, and what I believed. I believed that ETs exist going in. I believed in all this weird stuff going in because I was already having experiences with it from the time I was a teenager. And they still took me, gave me a badge, gun, and let me handle money, right? And classified. Anyway, all joking aside, when you get in there, there's all sorts of weirdos like us who believe this stuff too. But what it did was it grounded me, because as a person, in my personal experience, I'm with all you guys out there. I think this stuff's real. I think this stuff is true. But the professional experience in keeping me grounded, keeping anyone grounded, helps you do the research better. You know how to classify your evidence. You know how to objectively analyze things. And it also helps you see through BS, quite frankly. The things I learned when it comes to interviewing subjects, interrogating, things like that, it really helps when you're talking to a witness. Now, it helps you determine if that is a witness or a so-called self-proclaimed witness. And you learn little tells that you can pretty quickly spot the liars, the people that are fudging. And I use that lightly because, you know what, in the world I was in before, a liar's trying to get you off the trail of their crime. In this world, in this community, people just want to be part of the fun. But there's people out there that say, oh, me too, I've seen one. And you talk to them a little bit and you realize, okay, no, they haven't. But, you don't come down hard on them, unless they're out there setting themselves up as something and they're doing it big time. Then we owe it to the community and the field to call them out on it. But it just made me, a young guy who believed, in a lot of the stuff that I still do, it made me be a better researcher because of that grounding in evidence and analysis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I spent time as a deputy sheriff, and not
You know
nearly.
what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. There is so many different reasons in this field, particular, that people could be trying to throw you off the chain, just like you said. Could be they just went way too far down the rabbit hole and couldn't find their way back out.
Yeah.
They could just want to fit in. There's any number of reasons, but coming from fields that you come from and a field that I come from, it's important to stay grounded. It's important to go far down the rabbit hole. You could follow a lead. The lead doesn't pan out. You just back right out and on to the next one. So I think that's really important for an investigator, especially in this field.
Because I think you'll agree with this. Even grounded guys like us have had, or if not, they're going to have some pretty extraordinary experiences, which, are experiences you've had. There's no way you convince someone else that you've had them. And by being grounded, to stay cool-headed and a little humility, and because even the most grounded person in this field is at some point going to come up against whether it's synchronicity or some other uncanny thing. And I'm sure you have, I know I have faced the weirdness. So that's why it's all more important to have that tether.
Yep, exactly. I've had experience that somebody doesn't want to believe me, no big deal. I just continue with my life and continue pursuing the subject that we all care deeply about.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal. What are we doing next? So I want to ask you, there's a lot of talk, especially in the last couple of years, about legacy programs studying UFOs. So I thought you were a particularly interesting person to ask about this.
Right.
How plausible do you think it is that there are these super secret programs, USAPs studying advanced tech for decades, without oversight, without any kind of real leaks? So I thought, coming from your background, maybe you could weigh in.
Within the context of Roswell in particular, I wrote a whole book on that. I have come to, just since I mentioned Roswell, I have come to the position, I'm not going to say the conclusion because I might learn something new, right? But based on everything I know and research so far, I do not think Roswell had anything to do with extraterrestrials. I don't think it was even connected to anything interdimensional. And folks, I believe in both extraterrestrials and interdimensionals. And in the very same book that I'm talking about, I talk about interdimensionals. So, but Roswell itself, the Roswell incident, I think it is a fine example, a perfect example of what we're talking about when we're talking about secret technology. In my opinion, in a nutshell, and the ET people hate this. I don't care. I read my book, Shimmering Light, at lulu.com. I'm going to tell you what's in there now, but, I think Roswell was America's first attempt at manned space flight. And because it was in those early years of the Cold War and paranoia was high, something went wrong on the flight. I think obviously on the return, they crashed, they lost the crew. And again, my book goes into all the little details on this, but they would rather have told us that it was men from another world than admit publicly that we had gone up into space, for the Russians to then say, oh, okay, they're up there. What did they learn from this? They just wanted to keep a lid on everything back then. So it was easier for people to believe it was little men from another world. And this kind of got blown out of proportion. What people don't realize is, and again, I go into this in the book in greater detail, but essentially the lore, the legend of Roswell really started around 1980 with the Bill Moore book and, the Roswell incident. And that's when it started becoming more popular. And in the last about 20, 25 years ago, there were researchers that dug into Roswell finally, and they found that some of the popular evidence and testimony that people still to this day quote was proven to be BS. Okay, but they don't want to hear that because the ET lobby is also the ET industry. Okay, Roswell as an ET event is relatively lucrative. People think that the UFO dollar is big. It's not that big unless you're Chris Carter and, X-Files. But the ET thing has had the stronghold, and they don't like to hear this. But when you really dig in and look closely, as I have, and wrote the details, and by the way, I presented at Contact in the Desert when they had to do it online because of COVID. And I gave a presentation on these very details. So people can go back and check that out or look it up on the Contact website. It's there. But I stand by this. And a good objective or another author who has pointed out the very earthly explanation for Roswell is Dr. Joseph Farrell. And his most unpopular book The most inconvenient book before Shimmering Light joined it, my book, Shimmering Light, it was Roswell and the Reich. Oh my gosh, people do not want to hear about that book. But sorry, folks, it's about like that thick and chock full of good research and analysis that has to be considered. Now, I disagree with Dr. Farrell. He thinks it was literally a German post-war group, which I think the group does exist, but he thinks that explains the Roswell craft. I argue that, think about it. After the war, we had the Operation Paperclip aerospace engineers and rocket scientists and the aerospace medicine guys, which is more important than people realize. We had them all in the same place at the same time with tons of money and almost carte blanche. So you have guys that can design the craft, and think of the Horton brothers. Don't think of a flying saucer, because it was not a saucer. Think of the Horton brothers, who, by the way, were missing at the time. Think of the Horton brothers and that kind of technology and that knowledge base. Okay. Think of, the engineers, the aerospace medicine specialists who keep human beings alive in space, and they're all in New Mexico there. So what are you going to do? These guys, from the time they were kids, were dreaming of putting people in space, and there they are all together with tons of money and whatever resources they want. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to try it. They're going to build a spacecraft. They're going to put people on it, and they're going to shoot them up there. And again, Cold War, they're going to clamp a tight lid on it. It's not as fun for a lot of people as ET. But sorry, folks, from my perspective and my research, I find much more evidence for something like that than the traditional ET or even interdimensional explanation.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I've never really heard it put that way before, but I don't know, but it's looking at it just from the outside perspective here, it kind of does tie a nice little bow around Roswell, and it does make sense. So it's certainly worth, reading your book, Shimmering Light, and doing some research on the subject, because, even we have to explore possibilities, even if we don't like where they might lead. If we really want to believe Roswell happened, you have to follow the evidence where it leads.
And I think it happened. I do think it happened. But also, for the record, I remind folks, I think ETs exist. I think they've been coming here. I think they still come here. They're going to continue to come here. I think there are ET UFOs. Look at it this way. I've said this. 90% of genuine UFO sightings, in my opinion, are human technology that the public just isn't aware of. Okay? That leaves 10%, which includes the ET possibility, plus interdimensional, plus, other things. But I want you to think about something. People go, oh, only that's less than 10% would be ET. Well, think about something. A few years back, I did the statistics, and there were on average 5,000 UFO reports in a given month around the world. Okay? So I'm going to be generous. Let's say 10% could be ET. Well, let's say that out of those 5,000 reports, only 500 were legitimate. All the other ones were just people making stuff up or misidentifying, airplanes and stuff. So you're left with 500 in a given month, every month, but in a given month. Well, 10% of that is still 50. That's 50 possible ETs that I recognized. You only need one to prove it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think ETs are coming here. I just don't think Roswell was otherworldly.
Fair enough. Kind of building off that, let me ask you that. Do you have any theories on what their purpose is? Why are they visiting us?
Science, trade, science exploration, study. I mean, think about it. We went through our known European, so to speak, in the West age of exploration, right? And what did we do? We went over to look at resources we could exploit. We trade, money, that kind of thing. there was a lot of science couched in that, embedded in that. And then before the glorious West's age of exploration, us folks in the West, a lot of them tend to think that we're the greatest thing in human history. But before us, when we were still painting ourselves blue and living in caves in Europe, there were the people in the East in this Vedic civilization, and they were having their age of exploration. Check out the Cham Empire, for example. So when any civilization goes out exploring, you're going to have some that are flamboyant. Look, we're here. You're going to have some that are belligerent. They're there to exploit living beings too, other living creatures, either enslave them or slaughter them and take what they have. This is going to happen it has happened to us in the past from outer space, and it's going to continue to happen to us. It doesn't mean that the military industrial complex is not going to use that to lie to us and say, oh, that's happening, when it's not. But I do think it does happen. So it all depends on the objective of the civilization, to answer your question. Are they like Starfleet on TV, where it's science and diplomacy, a little trade mixed in, or is it conquest minded? And in between that, is it just to exploit resources? I don't know. So it depends on the civilization. I think all are possible, and I think all have been motivations of various civilizations coming here. And there could be even a mystical or spiritual objective thrown in there.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because what I was just thinking about, mystic spiritual, there's nowhere more mystic spiritual in America than Mount Shasta. And we were talking about the Vedic civilization, how does that tie into Mount Shasta and the Lemurians and all that good stuff?
Well, this is my opinion. Lemuria is a reflection of this greater lost Vedic civilization that I'm not the only one, but I am a proponent of its existence, but likely existence. And in one of my books, Secret Missions 4, The Esoteric Napoleon, I did the Esoteric Napoleon Volume 2, which is about the Louisiana Territory. I think that Napoleon had information, because Napoleon, in my book, Esoteric Napoleon, I show through my research, I show that he was fascinated with these topics, with lost civilizations and, forgotten technology. He was that was more interesting to him than politics and even military science. And he was brilliant at, military science and such. So I suspect, as I present in the book, that Napoleon, by the way, in 1802, before he sold it to Thomas Jefferson, the Louisiana Territory, he ordered his naval secretary to put together a special team, and under deepest secrecy, they were reportedly, in actual documents that he wrote, they were reportedly commissioned to go explore secretly as much as they could something in the Louisiana Territory. We don't know what happened on that expedition. All we know is that a year later, he sells it to to the United States via Thomas Jefferson. Remember, Congress was pissed off at Jefferson because he kind of did the Louisiana Purchase on executive action. Congress didn't approve it, but he did it. He was smart enough. But I also suspect that Thomas Jefferson, who was a scholar of these things, the strange as much as the practical, I think he and Napoleon shared the suspicion that there were relics and remnants and signs of a lost civilization to be found in this territory. And I argue that it was this lost Vedic civilization. And I point out, like, the Cahokia bird, or is that right? The Birdman. There's Cahokia the city, and then I think it is the Cahokian Birdman. I'm sorry, I'd have to reach for the book. It's been a couple of years since I wrote it. But I think that that would also explain if they were in the region of the Louisiana Territory. In my opinion, they were all across the continent. So I think the mysteries of Mount Shasta have a connection to this lost Vedic civilization. Remember, there's also the stories of an underground presence of, a mysterious people. And you remember I mentioned the two threads that tie all my books together. One of them is the goddess Hecate, and that's a whole other discussion. The other one are the mysterious Tuatha De Danann. And let's just say that legends like Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, these mysterious guys who show up on a raft or show up on the shores of certain places and help raise the level of their civilization with their technology and stuff. Other people before me have said these could have been survivors of the disaster in Atlantis or Lemuria or what have you. I think that because we see in the lore of the Tuatha De Danann that when they disappeared from the British Isles, these stories of these mysterious people show up in other parts of the world, help raise the civilizations there. And then when they disappear from those parts of the world, they reappear where they had been seen before. So I think the Tuatha De Danann are a civilization of people who came from somewhere else. And that's where we get into the interdimensional aspect. And anthropologists would tell you, oh, the Tuatha are just a bunch of Mediterranean tribes. Well, leave it to the anthropologists to kind of pee all over everything, because they got to limit their thinking. But when you read the actual material of their original arrival and the things they're able to do, they are not just Mediterranean tribes. The tribes that are associated with them, legitimately so, historically, I think these are tribes that they had encountered when they were in those parts of the world, and they fell under their banner, the Tuatha banner. So the anthropologists aren't completely wrong. They just don't have the big picture. I think there are the very earthly tribes that fall under the Tuatha label, but there's the Tuatha who I think definitely come from somewhere else.
That's absolutely fascinating. And that's a whole subject on its own. I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Holter.
Yep.
He does fascinating work as well. He was just on the Y-Files new show. I think it's called The Basement. Just a few days ago. And he was getting into kind of what you're saying as well. There's so much to learn and so much we're discovering that is kind of upending, anthropologists, archaeologists. I don't think we know half of what we think we know.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, Scott Walter requested, which book is it? One of my books. And then he kind of forgot I existed, but God bless him. So I'm really familiar with this stuff. What I like about it is he and I and David Paulides, what do we have in common? I'm watching one of Scott Walter's shows a few years back, and behind him, they didn't show it very much, but was a map of North America. And that map astonished me because this was before I was ever in contact with him and he asked for one of my books. This was before. In his own research, he's put together this map that is virtually identical to a map of telluric current and ley lines that a man named Sesheri did for me years before I saw this on Walter's show. And we had truly independently come to this because he's looking at the Templar stuff, right? And the relics. And I was looking with Sesheri, I was looking at the telluric current and the intersections and things like that. And then David Paulides, I'm getting goosebumps telling you about this because then I see a David Paulides book, and in there, his map, virtually identical to both Walter's and mine, again, independently, because his data has to do with the clusters of missing people. And the clusters in the missing people cases follow where the telluric currents are, as do where the Templars were going. What did the Templars know about this energy? What's really happening with these missing people that has to do with the telluric currents and the ley lines? Now, I I'm hoping to talk with them again about this, because I think, we could learn a lot from, looking at each other's data, because we independently came to this essentially the same map, and that's so important when it's independent, right? This isn't like one of us read the other guy's book and then, no. We're three independent researchers. And at the time I saw these maps, I had mine independently, since 2008 or 9. And so I think Shasta, you mentioned Mount Shasta, is definitely linked into these mysteries, the Templar mystery, the missing 411 mystery. And in my research, I think that Death Valley and all the lore with that has to do with this lost civilization as well.
Yeah, that is fascinating. God, if there was ever somebody to put together a panel discussion with you three guys on the panel,
I'd love it.
People would pay a lot of money to see that, me included. I hope somebody can organize that. Whoever's saying this, let's make it happen.
Well, we have to get the three of us to agree. So I think it would it'd have to be approached right. So that would be a great idea. I would enjoy that.
Yeah, if we can kind of navigate it the right way and in the right format, I think people can really learn a lot about what we haven't been taught in schools.
The key to being a researcher in this field is to don't think that you own these topics. That's a pitfall that some folks in our community fall into. They get mad if somebody talks about generally what they've talked about. No, I own that. That's mine. No, you own your personal specific research, Yeah. Your findings and stuff, but the general phenomenon out there, the mystery that you're finding, that's out there. And really, the more people looking at it, the better, I would think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You can't copyright somebody going missing or some other phenomenon. It's happening out in the world, and the more minds we can kind of get on it and thinking about it and investigating it and working together, only going to help us understand the issue itself better. So,
Right.
That's kind of my thinking on it. So, I wanted to follow up on Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
There's some really interesting stuff here. So, what did Napoleon experience, you think, when he spent the night alone in the Great Pyramid of Giza? It seemed to change his military or political kind of trajectory from that. What do you think happened to Napoleon in the Pyramid in Egypt?
Quite frankly, he had an astounding, life-changing psychotronic experience. When I did my esoteric Napoleon book, I mean, thousands of pages of biographical material, legitimate, honest, recognized historical material from multiple authors, from contemporary to his life, all the way up to the present and in between. One thing you learn is the whole thing about the Nostradamus thing is a bunch of BS. The guy who started that like 100 years ago, he later admitted, I was working with a terrible translation of Nostradamus, and I pretty much made that up. So, no, Nostradamus did not predict Napoleon, and certainly not as an antichrist. I came away an admirer of Napoleon. He was flawed. He was not perfect. No one is. But he was not the evil despot that 200 years of British historians slighted him with. It was a character assassination thing. But here's the thing. What you do find out is he indeed spent the night in the pyramid. You find out that, as I said before, he was fascinated with these lost civilizations and forgotten technology in the pyramid, no less. So he took a huge number of what he called the savants. These were scientists, okay, honest to goodness scientists, technicians, including hermeticists and alchemists. And his closest advisor was a guy named Gaspard Monge. Gaspard Monge, if you look him up, was one of the fathers of modern geometry, great mathematician and a theorist, in that. And he's credited with what's called the Monge point. The Monge point is the intersection of multiple planes in a pyramidal structure. And I did the research, I did my reading, I did my calculating and analysis, and in my book, I argue that the Monge point, where all possible planes in a pyramidal structure come together, is the so-called sarcophagus in the king's chamber. That is the intersection of all these planes. And I argue that Napoleon spent the night, the better part of the night, laying in that sarcophagus, and his consciousness tapped into the Monge point of these planes of, I'm losing my words here. You know what I mean? The multiple planes of reality or whatever. And he tapped into what some people might call Akashic record, but I think he was shown in advance a big chunk of the rest of his life. He was illuminated. He came out of there just white as a sheet. And when one of his close security guys asked him what happened in there, he said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And again, I go into the greater detail in the book, but I argue, and I think I'm the first and only one, that this idea of the Monge point being in the sarcophagus of the king's chamber, I think serves to explain the strange phenomena people are encountering when they go in there. And certainly it explains Napoleon's experience.
It also might account for why the Egyptian government is so closed off to letting people access some parts of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah. Could be.
They keep a pretty tight control on who has access to it, other than the tourist points. Also, you got to think Napoleon was so busy at that time. He had so much going on. What could possibly make him go and spend the night in the pyramid if he wasn't seeking for something extraordinary?
Right. He, as I said, when you learn about him, when you really do an honest, objective look at Napoleon, you find out he was fascinated with this stuff. This is why I was really disappointed. When I heard that Ridley Scott was going to do a Napoleon film, I thought, oh yeah, Ridley Scott, great. And I was really disappointed. It was well done, but it should have been just marketed and called Napoleon and Josephine, because it was a spot-on, accurate depiction of Napoleon's relationship and marriage with his wife, Josephine. It was perfect in that regard, but it really just did not even address his true intellectual love, and that was these things, even more so than military science and politics. That after Waterloo, when he knew he had to be on the run, he was gathering, when he went back to the residential palace, he was gathering tools and supplies and a library for exploration of the Americas. He was going to spend the rest of his life. He stated this. He goes, you know what? I'm done with all this politics and war. I'm spending the rest of my life in archaeological expeditions of the Americas. I might even go to California. Now, as I present in my book and lay out the historical details, and this did not start with me, many scholars for the last 50 years have suspected this, Napoleon Bonaparte changed places with his brother at his brother's urging. And that was Joseph Bonaparte who went to the Rock, Helena, and that the British had imprisoned. And Napoleon Bonaparte, under his brother's identity, Joseph, spent the greater part of the remainder of his life living in the United States. There were people who knew it and suspected it. The British sent 2 men of war across the Atlantic right before they arrested Napoleon, because they suspected he's going to do it. The Americans are going to help him. And America loved him at that point. They sent an emissary. They said, look, his brother Joseph said there is a United States naval frigate off the coast, and they're ready to get you on board and take you to America. Please go. He and Joseph looked so remarkably alike that in the days before effective photography, right? He had used Joseph as a double for security before, and it worked. And his own brother, this is what historical witnesses documented. This is historical fact. This isn't the conspiracy theory. His own brother begged him. Others said, please change places. They'll never know it. Because at the time, Joseph and all of them thought that they were going to take Napoleon and put him in an estate kind of north of London. So he thought he was going to be living in a comfy estate in England and having this, cosmopolitan lifestyle, even if he was a captive. Nobody had any idea what the British were planning on doing, putting him on that rock island forever. So Joseph, naturally, he was the social butterfly more than Napoleon, believe it or not. So he would have been fine. There was even the names in the book. I'm doing a brain dump. You can Google it. But the biographer that the British officially sent to interview I call him the Bonaparte captive, believing he's Napoleon, even he, matter of historical record, documented, even he expressed his concerns back to England. He said, this is not Napoleon. This is not Napoleon. I think it's Joseph. And, we don't know what the response was, but I think Wellington knew. Wellington is the guy credited with, even though the Prussians, Wellington was the guy credited with defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. And here's an interesting thing. Here we have so-called Joseph Bonaparte walking down a street in Philadelphia, I think it was, because he was living in New Jersey. And there was a man who had been a close, almost like a Secret Service kind of guy, a personal guard of Napoleon's. A bunch of pro-Napoleon Bonapartists came to America and they were embraced. Anyway, walking down the street, and one of these guys who guarded Napoleon recognizes him and says, Mon Dieu, Emperor, it is you, you're alive. And witnesses say that the man said, no, I am Joseph. And insisted, no, I am Joseph. Well, years later, Wellington invites Joseph Bonaparte to his estate, and Joseph, who I think was Napoleon, goes to visit Wellington. And personally, I think they were just laughing it up, because I think Wellington knew. Wellington wasn't an idiot, and he didn't exactly think like the British officials who wanted to slander Napoleon every turn. But I think Napoleon, late in life, spent a little vacation with Wellington on his estate, and they were laughing it up, enjoying the wine and such. And there's all sorts of other little clues and mysteries that really support the idea that Napoleon switched places with Joseph. And like I said, this idea emerged at the time. It emerged seriously with historians, and they're taking it more seriously in the last 40 or 50 years. So didn't originate with me, but I think it's true. I think the man we know as Joseph after Waterloo that lived in the United States was actually Napoleon himself.
Wow. I mean, that is mind-blowing. I'm a student of history. My whole life, it's been my first love, history. And I'm going to be doing a deep dive on this for sure. I can see it. The British government certainly did all they can to destroy the reputation of Napoleon Bonaparte, not Wellington. I think Wellington had, at least after the war, India had great respect for Napoleon. Yeah. As a peer and an adversary, and the brilliance of really who Napoleon was. So I can see that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Definitely going to be checking out your book. What's the name of that book again? Your Napoleon series?
The Esoteric Napoleon. It's the 4th book in my Secret Missions series, which that's a whole other discussion, but check those out. Remember, folks, my book's not at Amazon, Lulu.com, Lulu.com. So, yeah, the Esoteric Napoleon and the Esoteric Napoleon Part 2 is about the Louisiana Purchase mystery. And, it's like I said, my fiction books really, one has literally directly led to the other. And I love that. I like that. I'll be, like I said, first nonfiction book was a book about Disneyland. And when that was done, I had some threads to pull, and that led to this weird mystery. And then studying that mystery led to this thing and that thing. And then all of that led to these secret missions books, because it started with the mystery of Juan Cabrillo. And then Richard Francis Burton, and then Ambrose Bierce, Napoleon. And, it's been an adventure, just a big trail of intellectual and historical adventure that's astounded me and perplexed me, and has also, the Empire of the Whale books introduced me to some pretty to the shadow world, as Young would say, and strange phenomena, the phenomena of synchronicity. It started with remote viewing. I was being informally trained in remote viewing, and that opened me up to all manner of strange phenomena. And I still get visits from ravens. And the trail, when Hecate, the goddess Hecate, emerged, it wasn't just in books and intellectually, it was through weirdness. So, I'm not a naysayer on the weird at all. But I do reserve the right to use critical thinking on individual claims, because when we have people not telling the truth, making stuff up, that hurts all the rest of the folks that are telling the truth, that have had a strange experience, and it kind of belittles and makes a mockery of a very real experience, because that way can lie madness, as we know. And you mentioned earlier, people can go so far down a rabbit hole that they can't get out. And I've been pretty deep in the rabbit hole just with the Empire of the Wheel investigation. That was a 7-year, 3-book period of my life that still, when certain doors are open, they never close. And it's going to be a theme of one of my talks, my main lecture at Contact in the Desert. See how we bring this around? There was an individual. Yeah, there was an individual who who was part of this Empire of the Wheel mystery, who has fascinated me to no end. And I have to do a deep dive on this guy's mystery. And so that'll be part of what I talk about at Contact in the Desert, the more of the cosmic depth and strangeness of this particular investigation. And it connects to the UFO world and the mono world and the ancient stuff and the modern. It's weird and wild, but it can have its potential dangers if you don't keep a sense of humor, right? You were in law enforcement, that you have to have a sense of humor in that work.
Yeah, can't do it otherwise.
Yeah, same here with this weird stuff. I think you'd agree.
Yeah, and guys, for the people watching this, there is so much of Walter's work that we didn't even touch on here. There is so much more to it that I would love to talk to Walter at a later date about. But there's just so much interesting work. Honest to God, I'm not pitching anything. It says this is from the heart. Go to lulu.com. Check out his books. There is incredible information here. And again, stuff that we haven't even touched on. If this wasn't enough for you, just what we touched on today should keep you busy for a couple of years, reading and researching. And there's a whole lot more. So if you want to see Walter, Contact in the Desert. I think it's May 28th to June 1st, Palm Springs. I will be there. Walter will be there. Walter, do we know what day you're speaking or what time slot yet or anything?
Not yet. They haven't posted the days or time slots, and I put in my my humble begging to not have a morning slot. I'm terrible in the mornings, and I really want my presentations to be the best I've ever given. So hopefully, whatever day it is, hopefully it's not a morning slot. So I'm lobbying for that. But no, they haven't laid out those details yet.
Okay, well, keep an eye on the schedule for when Walter. That is a lecture you're going to want to be at. I will certainly be there. Walter, anything else you want to say? Anything else we can touch on before we head out?
No, I think you're right. We got a good start. I'll be glad to come back anytime and talk with you. Again, the books, not Amazon. They're not good to small press folks most of the time. But lulu.com, print on demand. I'm the publisher. They're just the printer distributor. But also check out my YouTube channel, the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. And there's a lot of archived videos to check out. I talk about some of the things. Well, I talk about all the things in various episodes there. And I have live streams and current videos and stuff. So check that out, my channel at YouTube and the books at Lulu.
Yeah, and they will both be linked in this video. So click on the link, you'll find it. Walter, thank you very much. I look forward to meeting you at Contact in the Desert.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward. The days are counting down.
Yeah, I can't wait. Anytime you spend in Palm Springs is not a bad time.
Right? Yeah, I got a sister, and my sister and one of my sisters and my mom live out there, so they live that nice sunny life of Riley out there. So anytime I can get out there and go to dinner with them and stuff, I grab at it.
Yeah, I don't blame you. We're looking to move to Arizona in the next 12 months by family and myself.
Okay, there you go.
We've got to get out of the snow.
Yes.
Hey, Walter, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you on. I look forward to talking to you again sometime in the future.
Yes.
There's a lot more to talk about. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at Contact in the Desert.
Okay, looking forward to it.